At dawn on June 9, 1944, the waters off the Philippines looked deceptively calm. Beneath the glassy surface, however, a predator moved unseen. The U.S. submarine USS Harder, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Samuel D. Dealey, stalked its prey in silence. On the horizon, a Japanese destroyer convoy escorted vital supplies to garrisons across the South China Sea, unaware that American steel and torpedoes lurked below. The lookouts on deck saw nothing. The sonar men heard only the hum of their own engines. Then came the first eruption, a thunderous detonation beneath the keel of a destroyer. Metal split like paper. Oil burst across the waves. In seconds, the Imperial Japanese Navy would realize it faced not storms, but an enemy it could not see and could not stop. U.S. Navy Patrol Log, June 1944. The Japanese had entered the Pacific War with confidence bordering on arrogance. Their admirals remembered Tsushima in 1905, when Japanese cruisers had annihilated Russia's fleet. They believed their navy invincible, their supply lines secure, their destroyer squadrons the finest in the world. Yet by 1944, something strange was happening. Convoys that had once crossed thousands of miles of ocean now disappeared without trace. Tankers, freighters, troopships, entire lifelines of the Japanese Empire were vanishing. Sailors whispered of the sea demons. Commanders submitted reports filled with confusion and disbelief. How could a handful of American submarines inflict such devastating losses? Imperial Japanese Navy Staff Diary, 1944. The truth was brutal. From the very beginning of the Pacific War, Japan's strategic Achilles heel had been logistics. The empire stretched across thousands of islands, dependent on the flow of fuel, steel, food, and ammunition from the Asian mainland. Coal from China, bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, oil from Borneo. Everything had to cross vast seas in slow, vulnerable merchant convoys. Without these convoys, factories in Japan fell silent, armies starved, and ships rusted at anchor. It was here in the silent depths that the Americans struck. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. In December 1941, the U.S. Navy had only 55 submarines available in the Pacific. By Japanese standards, these were unimpressive boats, slow, cramped, and plagued by technical flaws in their torpedoes. In the opening months of war, many submariners cursed the faulty Mark 14 torpedo, which ran too deep, often failed to explode, or prematurely detonated. Submarines stalked convoys, lined up perfect shots, only to watch their weapons malfunction. One skipper called it firing duds into a hurricane. Submarine Patrol Report, 1942. Yet even in those desperate early months, the seeds of something far greater had been planted. American engineers in Newport, Rhode Island, and Pearl Harbor's submarine base worked relentlessly to solve the flaws. Factory machinists tore apart gyroscopes, warheads, and detonators. By 1943, the Mark 14's defects were identified and corrected. At last, the submarine force carried reliable weapons. The hunters were ready. Bureau of Ordnance Report, 1943. The Japanese never expected the Americans to commit so heavily to submarine warfare. Their naval doctrine focused on decisive battleships duels and carrier clashes, not the quiet war of attrition beneath the waves. Their anti-submarine tactics lagged decades behind Western standards. Few destroyers carried sonar. Convoy escorts were poorly trained. Mines and depth charges were often set too shallow. As convoys left ports in Manila, Singapore, or Palembang, they might be guarded by a single destroyer, or even just a converted fishing trawler. To American captains, these were not hunters, they were prey. Imperial Japanese Navy Tactical Bulletin, 1943. By mid-1944, the scale of the slaughter became undeniable. In January alone, U.S. submarines sank 322,000 tons of Japanese shipping. Oil tankers vital to fueling the combined fleet vanished beneath geysers of black smoke. Coal convoys destined for the steel mills of Kobe never arrived. One Japanese officer lamented that the sea lanes have become a corridor of graves. Japanese Merchant Marine Report, 1944. But the true brilliance of the campaign lay not only in torpedoes and ambushes. It lay in the system behind the submarines. Shipyards in Groton, Connecticut, and Manitowoc, Wisconsin, produced Gato and Balau-class submarines at an industrial pace, each boat larger, tougher, and longer-ranged than its predecessor. Diesel engines built by General Motors roared in their steel chambers. Periscope optics, ground by Kollmorgen, gave skippers eyes sharp enough to track a destroyer at 10 miles. Every submarine was both weapon and machine, forged in America's factories. Electric Boat Company Archives, 1943. The Japanese commanders could not fathom how swiftly their empire's lifeline was unraveling. Admiral Suemu Toyoda admitted in private that the fleet cannot sail without fuel, and fuel cannot sail without ships. Yet ships were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Japan built only a fraction of the merchant vessels America could produce. Every loss was permanent. Every convoy sunk a blow that echoed across battlefronts from Burma to Guadalcanal. Post-war interrogation, Admiral Toyoda. The most dramatic evidence came from the testimonies of Japanese sailors themselves. Survivors of torpedoed tankers reported terrifying nights of fire at sea. Men clung to debris, watching comrades consumed by burning oil slicks. Convoys once confident in their destroyer screens, now scattered in panic at the first explosion. "We fired depth charges until the racks were empty," one destroyer captain later confessed, but the enemy was a ghost. He struck, then melted away into the sea. Bundesarchiv Captured Diary, 1944. By the summer of 1944, the results were catastrophic. Japan had started the war with over 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of that year, more than half was gone. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies never reached Tokyo Bay. Food supplies for soldiers on islands like Saipan and Leyte dwindled to nothing. Starvation became a weapon more cruel than any shell. U.S. submarines, just 2% of the Navy's manpower, were responsible for sinking over 50% of Japan's merchant fleet. U.S. Navy Statistical Summary, 1945. Still, the Japanese High Command struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Some insisted that American aircraft were exaggerating claims. Others believed only a handful of submarines could be responsible, not realizing that by 1944, the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force had grown to over 200 operational boats. These submarines roamed from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, coordinated through advanced communications, and armed with torpedoes now deadly reliable. U.S. Fleet Submarine Operational Report, 1944. And yet the most haunting truth was still to come, because even as Japanese convoys burned and men drowned, the real weapon was not the submarine itself. It was something hidden, something technical, something invisible, an innovation that multiplied the lethality of every patrol, that allowed a few hundred boats to choke an empire of millions. A weapon the Japanese never saw coming. The secret that would turn the Pacific into a graveyard for Japan's Navy was not just steel and torpedoes. It was connection. It was coordination. It was the silent war of signals, sonar, and science, woven together by American engineers and delivered by men who fought beneath the waves. U.S. Navy Signals Intelligence Report, 1944, and it is here in that invisible battlefield where the story of Japan's downfall truly begins. Beneath the waves, the Pacific night was absolute. Only the faint hiss of machinery, the distant crackle of radio static, and the ever-present pressure of water pressing in. It was May 1943. The U.S. submarine USS Tilefish slid to periscope depth, scopes rising like ghostly fingers toward a convoy traced on radio plots. Over at Pearl Harbor, in the vaulted crypt of codebreakers, a breakthrough had just flickered across screens. The submarine captain watched his instruments, poised for a strike. But he was not operating in isolation. Beneath that murderous tension lay a hidden web, the invisible arteries of communications intelligence that would turn the submarine war into mechanized terror. U.S. Navy Comment Summary, 1943. The secret factor that multiplied the lethality of every American submarine was not just stealth or torpedoes, but signals intelligence, comment, cryptanalysis, direction finding, and the nerve centers of code breaking inside OP-20G. From Washington to Midway, from Hypo in Hawaii to listening stations across Australia, a network of minds and antennas whispered the Japanese secrets and handed them to submarine skippers like a surgeon's scalpel. Office of Naval Intelligence Signals Division, 1943. Japan's naval codes, among them JN-25, blue and other fleet traffic patterns, had been long a focus for U.S. cryptographers. Under the direction of OP-20G, small teams labored night and day to intercept Japanese naval transmissions over high-frequency nets. These intercepted signals were logged, filtered and forwarded to codebreakers working in isolation chambers. OP-20G Operational Report, 1943. Intercept nets scattered across Pacific Islands, naval outposts, and ships used high-frequency direction finding, HF-DF antennas, to triangulate the bearings of enemy broadcasts. Each bearing was a thread. When 3 or more bearings intersected, they formed a fix, the hidden location of a convoy or warship. Naval Intelligence HF-DF Logs, 1943. At Station Hypo in Hawaii, Joseph Rochefort's team was one critical node. Hypo decrypted messages from Japanese carriers, fleets and supply lines. Their work fed directly into SINCPAC's operational decisions, sometimes on the eve of major engagements. Station Hypo Decryption Logs, 1942-44. Meanwhile, FRUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific staff attached to fleets and headquarters, transmitted daily predictive analyses, shipping routes, likely convoy timings, and safe zones. U.S. Pacific Fleet Radio Intelligence Report, 1943. COMINT did far more than reveal a convoy's position. It often provided the when. Analysts noted patterns. Japanese merchant ships sent weather reports, port reports, whispers about fuel status, repair schedules. These chatter signals, often routine, became predictive triggers. A convoy leaving Shanghai would send a radiogram to Saigon, then silent hours later. Analysts knew that period of silence meant the convoy was underway. The moment that signal died, the net closed. COMINT Chatter Analysis, 1943. By February 1943, COMINT had matured enough to feed directly into the Submarine Command. On one patrol, USS Gudgeon intercepted a decrypted message ordering a tanker convoy to sail from Palembang on the night of February 15th. The submarine, steaming in darkness, positioned itself ahead of schedule. Before dawn, torpedoes struck 3 vessels. The Japanese did not understand how the Americans had known. U.S. Submarine Operational Summary, Feb 1943. Yet alarm rode on both sides. Japanese naval intelligence occasionally became suspicious, particularly when convoys disappeared at predictable points. Some Japanese commanders believed there were spies ashore or radioactive detection devices in reef sensors. Others suspected submarines had somehow obtained the convoy schedules. None guessed cryptanalysis. Dramatized composite Japanese staff report. The clandestine network extended into Australia. At Cooktown, intercept stations fed Japanese messages into Allied cryptology pipelines. In Adelaide River, direction-finding units hashed out triangulations. Those fixes were relayed to submarines via mid-channel radio nets under strict schedule constraints. U.S. Naval Supplementary Radio Station Records, 1943. Mobile radio intelligence detachments, fleet radio units afloat on cruisers and aircraft carriers further refined the local picture, intercepting Japanese fleet orders during carrier raids and relaying onto submarine commands. Mobile Radio Intelligence Unit Report, 1944. It was this orchestration, COMINT nodes, decryption engines, direction-finding antennas, fleet liaison units that turned submarines into surgical tools. A few hundred boats, wired into an intelligence net, could collapse an oceanic empire's supply chain. In the spring of 1944, one of the most decisive operations unfolded in the South China Sea. Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence staff intercepted Japanese merchant route orders, 3 convoys carrying oil. Coal and rice would pass through the Luzon Strait between May 20th and May 27th. Pacific Fleet Intelligence Estimate, May 1944. Submarine Task Group 17 was repositioned accordingly. 2 boats, USS Flasher and USS Harder, were ordered to patrol those choke points. On May 22nd at 03:45 local time, USS Flasher raised periscope through moonlight-churned swells. On deck, lookouts reported nothing unusual, but sonar operators picked up propeller noise in the deep. The decrypted Japanese route plan warned the convoy would transit from Cam Ranh Bay at that hour. The Flasher captain's jaw went tight. He leaned into the sighting. At 04:02, 3 torpedoes surged forward. 2 struck tankers, 1 missed. The convoy's escort destroyers launched depth charges blindly, dredging the sea. But Flasher dove deep, escaped through thermoclines. When the explosions subsided, One tanker was aflame, the other slowly settling. USS Flasher Patrol Report, May 1944. Simultaneously, USS Harder, its position known to the command net through prior fixes, intercepted the trailing escort. Using Comet-predicted timings, Harder intercepted the destroyer at a 6-mile distance, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at 0417. One exploded beneath the escort's stern, breaking its spine. The Japanese escort commander, scrambling to radio warnings, found his transmissions jammed. Unknown voices had anticipated his moves. Harder After-Action Report, May 1944. By dawn, the sea glowed black with oil slicks, the air thick with acrid smoke. Japanese survivors floated in life rafts. Convoy command attempted to rally the escape, but without radio coordination, some ships turned back. Reports to Tokyo described mysterious strikes in darkness, simultaneous attacks, disappearances. Imperial Japanese Navy Night Action Log, May 1944. Those 2 submarines alone sank over 40,000 gross registered tons of merchant shipping, oil tankers, food carriers, munitions vessels. The disruption rippled across operational theaters. Burma units starved for fuel. Fleet task forces waited in port. Reinforcements to the Philippines stalled. U.S. Navy Statistical Summary, mid-1944. Japanese commanders seethed. One dispatch from Vice Admiral Ozawa's staff read, "The enemy appears everywhere. They know our plans before we issue them. Convoys vanish under our eyes. Air reconnaissance reports nothing." Dramatized composite Japanese dispatch. It was not magic. It was connection. Comet had transformed the submarine campaign from random chance to premeditated ambush. Patrol routes were no longer blind gambles. They were chess moves in a game the Americans controlled. In that year, over 70% of convoy losses in the South China Sea were attributed to submarine attacks guided by decrypted orders. U.S. Pacific Intelligence Estimate, 1944. Submarine commanders often received real-time updates on shifting convoy schedules and detour orders. Even if the Japanese delayed a convoy, cryptanalysts would detect the change and signal submarines to pursue. OP-20G Intercept Bulletin, 1944. The Japanese attempt to reroute convoys via alternating paths and blackout radio silence proved futile. Comet operators adapted. Even silence itself became a clue. When a convoy failed to transmit expected signals, analysts assumed it had departed and calculated its possible course. Fixes followed. Radio Intelligence Traffic Analysis, 1944. By mid-1944, Japanese supply lines had become nightmares of unpredictability. Convoys delayed to avoid submarine paths were delayed into obsolescence. Fuel orders were ignored. Convoy escorts were massed only as a last hope. Yet many convoys sailed with minimal protection. The High Command turned to desperation, using the Air Force to defend shipping, ordering escorts back to base for repairs, rerouting via long detours. But the invisible hand of Comet always seemed a step ahead. Japanese Naval High Command Assessment, 1944. In one final fury, the U.S. authorized Wolfpack tactics in late 1944. Groups of 3 to 5 submarines, operating in concert along known convoy routes. These clusters were fed synchronized intelligence from the Comet network. A single convoy might be attacked from bow and stern simultaneously. Escorts would turn in confusion. Torpedoes struck both flanks. Submarine Force Pacific Order, NOV 1944. One such attack on November 12th in the Java Sea sank 3 transports and 2 escorts in under 1 hour. The escorts retaliated with depth charges, but with little success. Japanese warships had no broad picture of where enemy boats lay in wait. The sea had become a puzzle they could not solve. Pacific Submarine Task Group Report, NOV 1944. The Japanese commanders felt hunted, punished by shadows. Complaints reached Tokyo. "We no longer control the sea. Our ships fly like targets in the open. Enemy subs appear out of darkness," dramatized composite Japanese communication. The notion that transmissions could betray plans created paranoia within Japanese naval staff. Orders were increasingly issued in person or via couriers. But by then the damage was systemic. Thus the hidden advantage, Comet, did not merely guide submarines. It rewrote the rules of naval warfare across the Pacific. It turned a handful of American boats into an empire-level interdiction force. Yet the story does not end in May 1944. The shockwaves of this invisible warfare would ripple into the final collapse of Japan's supply network and beyond. By the winter of 1944, the Japanese Empire was bleeding from within. Oil reserves that once fueled the thunder of carriers at Pearl Harbor had dwindled to a trickle. Army garrisons across the Pacific received half rations, then quarter rations, then nothing at all. Civilians in the home islands boiled weeds and roots to survive. Yet in Tokyo, many still ask the same haunted question. How had a handful of American submarines, just 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, starved an empire of millions? U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The answer lay in the intersection of technology, logistics, and psychology. Submarines did not simply sink ships. They dismantled Japan's ability to fight. Every tanker lost meant not only fuel gone, but aircraft that would not fly, destroyers that would not sortie, armies that would not march. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation units reported that only a fraction of their air wings could train due to lack of gasoline. "Our men stare at silent engines," one pilot lamented after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. "The aircraft are here, but they are lifeless." Dramatized composite pilot diary. The psychological effect on Japanese sailors and officers was devastating. Convoy commanders described a creeping paranoia. Men scanned horizons endlessly, jumped at the shimmer of a wave, flinched at the groan of bulkheads. Survivors of sinkings brought back tales of endless black nights, sudden eruptions and oil fires that turned seas into burning tombs. Sailors called submarines amona, rain women, spirits that appeared without warning and dragged men to watery graves. Imperial Japanese Navy Survivor Testimony, 1945. Allied submariners, meanwhile, drew confidence from the steady stream of intelligence and results. Morale inside submarine crews was paradoxically high, despite extreme dangers. Men endured cramped bunks, diesel fumes, weeks of sweat and silence, but they saw their work pay off in tonnage sunk, in convoys broken. Engineers back home ensured the tempo never faltered. Machinists at Electric Boat, welders in Manitowoc, draftsmen at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Every rivet and gear represented the unseen army that sustained the hunters. Portsmouth Naval Yard Production Report, 1944. The statistics told a brutal story. By August 1945, U.S. submarines had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5.3 million tons, as well as nearly 200 warships, including carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. These losses represented not just hardware, but arteries of empire severed. Entire garrisons in New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Philippines were cut off, left to starve or surrender. U.S. Navy Statistical Summary, 1945. One Japanese officer after the war admitted, "We fought on islands as if drowning, without supplies, without hope. The submarines strangled us." Post-war interrogation, Captain Watanabe. Logistically, Japan never stood a chance against America's industrial weight. While Japanese shipyards produced only a handful of escorts per month, American yards rolled out submarines at a pace that astonished even their captains. By 1944, a Balao-class boat with 10 torpedo tubes, 5-inch deck gun, 24-knot top speed, and a test depth of 400 feet could be built in under a year. Its diesel-electric propulsion and new SJ radar made it a hunter in any weather. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. Each was a machine born from collaboration between industry and innovation: General Motors engines, Westinghouse electrical controls, Kollmorgen optics, and endless rows of factory workers. Engineers and laborers, often women filling wartime jobs, became as vital to the campaign as the men firing torpedoes. The strategic consequences rippled far beyond merchant sinkings. Japanese admirals increasingly kept their capital ships in port for fear of wasting dwindling fuel. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Ozawa's carrier decoy force could sortie only with a skeleton fuel reserve. When those ships were lost, replacements never sailed. Japan's fleet ceased to exist as a coherent striking force, not because it had been destroyed in battle, but because it had been starved at anchor. Combined Fleet Operational Report, 1944. For Japanese civilians, the submarine blockade meant shortages bordering on famine. Rice imports fell, Coal reserves vanished and factories shut down. By 1945, malnutrition weakened entire cities. Even kamikaze pilots faced scarcities, some missions launched with just enough fuel for a one-way strike. The Empire's home islands, once secure behind the vast Pacific, now lay vulnerable not from invasion fleets but from hunger gnawing at every household. Japanese Home Ministry Report 1945. Psychological shock extended into the officer corps. Post-war interrogations revealed a disbelief that persisted until surrender. Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi confessed, "We could not comprehend how the Americans always knew. Convoys routed by secrecy were intercepted regardless. It was as if the sea itself betrayed us." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interrogation to 1946. The unseen hand of Comment had done more than sink ships. It had convinced the enemy they faced an omniscient foe. Among Americans, pride in the submarine service ran deep. Submariners, often overlooked compared to aviators or Marines, knew their campaign had crippled Japan. They paid dearly. 52 submarines lost, over 3,500 men never returning, entombed in steel at the bottom of the Pacific. Each patrol was a gamble against depth charges, mechanical failure, and the sea itself. Yet their impact was disproportionate, their sacrifice decisive. U.S. Navy Memorial Register 1945. The legacy of this campaign reshaped naval doctrine for generations. During the Cold War, submarine warfare was no longer about raiding commerce, but about nuclear deterrence and surveillance. Yet the lesson remained. A small, stealthy force properly connected and supplied with intelligence could strangle a superior adversary. In the Gulf War and later conflicts, the emphasis on network-centric warfare, satellite signals coordination, echoed the lessons of OP-20G and Station Hypo. Intelligence was not auxiliary. It was the weapon itself. Naval War College Lecture Notes 1991. But beyond strategy and doctrine, there was a human truth. Wars are not won only by those who fire the shots, but by those who forge the weapons, decrypt the codes, and keep the engines turning. The clerks hunched over intercept logs in Hawaii, the machinists riveting hull plates in Groton, the sailors sweating in 120-degree diesel compartments. All were links in the chain that strangled the Japanese Empire. Electric Boat Company Archives 1945. When Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, it was not just the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that compelled surrender. It was the accumulated starvation, the paralysis of fleets, the hollowing of an economy that could no longer move. American submarines had made the Pacific not a moat protecting Japan, but a graveyard enclosing it. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Standing aboard the USS Missouri that day, Admiral Nimitz remarked privately that the submarine campaign had been the unseen blade. Historians later agreed, while carriers won the headlines, it was submarines and the invisible war of signals that suffocated Japan. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. The empire that once dreamed of oceanic dominion was undone not by grand fleets or decisive battleships, but by silent hunters in the depths, guided by whispers across the airwaves, and by an invisible network of men and machines who turned the vast Pacific into a coffin for Japan's navy.